There are people who spend their entire lives trying to kill a pain that was born before they even learned how to speak, a pain that existed in the body before the mind had words to understand it, a pain they never chose but inherited like a silent genetic curse, the kind you don't remember yet feel every single day. You look at an addict and your first thought is lack of character, but character has nothing to do with it. What you don't see is the child they once were, the one who learned how to disappear in plain sight. The child who flinched at footsteps, who hid behind closed doors during arguments that shook the walls. The child who discovered early that the safest way to survive was to become small, quiet, invisible. Addiction isn't about pleasure. Pleasure is accidental. Addiction is escape from an internal landscape that has never felt safe. It is the chemical relief of chronic emotional pain. It is an improvised anesthesia. It is the momentary silence in a mind that has been screaming since childhood. Don't ask why the addiction, ask why the pain, Gabor Maté says. This isn't just a clever line, it's a compass. Because once you understand the pain, the addiction suddenly makes sense. You know the girl who takes pills just to sleep? The guy who gets drunk every weekend because sobriety feels like suffocating? The friend glued to their phone because being alone with their thoughts feels like torture? They're not weak. They're survivors of childhoods where feeling anything was dangerous. Survivors of families that normalized yelling, ignoring, gaslighting, coldness, or emotional absence. Some wounds never show blood. They show patterns. The child who never cried becomes the adult who can't express emotion. The child who had to take care of depressed parents becomes the adult who feels guilty for resting. The child who had to please everyone becomes the adult who can't say no. Not to people, not to addictions, not to anything that offers a moment of relief. Trauma isn't just what happened. Trauma is also what never happened. The care that never came. The affection that wasn't offered. The presence that was technically there, but emotionally unreachable. A mother who cooked but never connected. A father who provided but never saw you. A family where emotions were treated like inconveniences. Absence, repeated often enough, becomes identity. The child's brain is like wet cement. Everything leaves a mark. And when childhood is filled with chaos or emotional emptiness, the brain wires itself for survival, not for living. The prefrontal cortex, the part that calms impulses, grows under stress. The amygdala, the alarm system, becomes overactive. The stress response system begins to operate like the world is always dangerous. This isn't drama, this is nervous system architecture. So think about addiction again. Why would someone repeatedly return to a behavior that destroys their body, relationships, and dignity? Because for a few seconds, that behavior gives them something childhood never did. Silence, calmness, stillness, a break from themselves. People imagine the addict chasing euphoria, but what they're really chasing is relief. For someone who grew up surviving emotional hurricanes, that moment of peace becomes irresistible. Not because it's fun, but because it's the only place the pain stops. Maté explains it beautifully. You don't choose addiction, addiction chooses you, based on the pain you never had a chance to face. Addiction is an attempt to regulate emotions in a body that never learned emotional regulation. It begins as comfort, it becomes coping, then it turns into chains. At first, addiction doesn't destroy you, it rescues you, it holds you together. It becomes the only thing that feels predictable in a world that has never been predictable. That is why people don't quit easily. Not because they enjoy the addiction, but because the addiction became a substitute for the love they never received. And yes, this is biological too. Trauma starves the brain of dopamine, the very chemical that gives motivation, pleasure, and hope. When dopamine is low, simple life tasks feel overwhelming. Emotional pain becomes heavier. Existence becomes harder. A substance or behavior, even temporarily, forces dopamine to rise. So the brain remembers, that helped, do it again. Over time, the brain becomes dependent, not on the drug itself, but on the emotional relief it brings. This is why people switch addictions. Quit alcohol, become addicted to work. Quit work addiction, fall into addiction to validation, porn, food, shopping, toxic relationships. The addiction isn't the issue, the emptiness underneath is. And deeper still lives the most painful truth of all, shame. Not guilt, not fear, shame. The quiet belief that I am wrong. Shame is the first drug most people ever taste. Shame convinces them they are unworthy of help, unworthy of love, unworthy of healing. Shame is the reason they don't reach out. Shame is the reason they relapse. Shame is the reason they choose the pain they know over the comfort they don't trust. People don't get addicted to substances, they get addicted to escaping the person they believe they are. Trauma creates stories. I ruin everything. I don't deserve better. I am too much. I am not enough. These stories become their operating system. Children can't say, "My parents failed me emotionally." They say, "I must be the problem." This belief follows them into adulthood, shaping relationships, choices, and addictions. Why choose emotionally unavailable partners? Because that feels familiar. Why sabotage good things? Because shame whispers, "This isn't for you." Why numb yourself? Because living with untreated trauma feels like being trapped inside a burning house. Addiction becomes the fire escape. You can throw away the drug, but you can't throw away the feeling that something is wrong with you. Not until you understand where that feeling came from. Healing addiction is not about willpower or punishment. Healing starts with connection, the very thing trauma stole. Because the opposite of addiction isn't sobriety, it's relationship. It's being seen, it's being understood. It's having someone finally say, "You weren't weak, you were alone, and now you don't have to be." That is when healing begins. The unseen child and the nervous system that never rested. Have you ever wondered what happens to a child who grows up without a safe place to be themselves? A child who learns that their emotions don't fit, their needs inconvenience others, their voice is too loud, their sadness is too heavy? That child doesn't simply grow up. They adapt, they shrink. They learn to monitor every expression, every tone in the room. They learn to anticipate danger before danger arrives. They become experts at reading faces, moods, silences, not because they're intuitive, but because survival demanded it. That child becomes an adult whose nervous system is always on standby, alert, ready, braced. This is where addiction enters, not as a choice, as a physiological response. When your body has been a battlefield since childhood, you stop trying to feel safe. You start trying to feel not unsafe. Addiction is the shortcut to that feeling. The body remembers what the mind forgot. Most people underestimate trauma because they think trauma lives in memory, but trauma lives in the body, in the muscles, in the breath, in the nervous system. It's the tightness in the chest that appears out of nowhere, the dread in the morning, the sudden panic when nothing is wrong, the numbness that creeps in during conversations, the exhaustion that never goes away. This isn't drama, this is biology. When a child has to endure emotional neglect, unpredictability, shouting, violence, or coldness, their nervous system learns one lesson: I am not safe. That lesson becomes embedded in the way they breathe, react, connect, sleep, love, and cope. So when people say, "just stop using," they're ignoring the most fundamental truth. The addiction isn't the problem. The addiction is the body's attempt to regulate what trauma dysregulated. Take away the addiction and the body still screams. Take away the coping mechanism and the pain still crawls beneath the skin. Addiction is not the fire, it's the extinguisher. A destructive one, yes, but often the only one the person ever had. The trauma of what should have been. Most people understand trauma as events: violence, assault, disasters, tragedies. But some of the deepest traumas are the things that never happened. The hug after crying, the apology after being hurt, the reassurance after being frightened, the presence during loneliness, the comfort during fear. Humans don't only need food and shelter, we need attunement. We need to be mirrored. We need to feel felt. A child who gets fed but not seen grows up emotionally starving. They learn to navigate the world with a hole inside them, a hole shaped like affection, validation, safety, belonging. Later, addiction fits perfectly into that hole. Why the smart, the sensitive, and the creative suffer most? It's not the weak who fall into addiction, it's often the sensitive, the empathetic, the intuitive, the gifted, the children who felt everything too strongly, the ones who noticed what no one else did, the ones whose emotions were dismissed as too much, the ones who carried adult-level burdens with child-sized hearts. The more sensitive the nervous system, the more overwhelming the pain, the more tempting the escape. This is why so many brilliant minds drown in addiction, why artists, thinkers, musicians, and deeply emotional people often fall into destructive coping. They feel deeply, but they never learned how to hold what they feel. Addiction becomes their emotional prosthetic, the crutch for wounds that never had a chance to heal. The generational hand-me-down of pain. Trauma rarely starts with the person carrying it. It's inherited. A father who drinks to silence his depression, a mother who shuts down because she was never nurtured, grandparents who survived wars, famine, migration, poverty, but never processed what they endured. Pain travels through bloodlines disguised as personality. A parent who couldn't hold their child wasn't cold, they were carrying their own unprocessed wounds. A child growing up in that household absorbs the emotional leftovers of generations. Addiction often begins decades before the person using was ever even born. This is why Maté says, the question is not why the addiction, but why the pain, and whose pain is it? Perfectionism, the respectable addiction. Some addictions get punished, drugs, alcohol, gambling. Others get rewarded, work, productivity, achievement, perfectionism. Society applauds the child who grows up to be the high performer, the overachiever, the one who never rests, the one who never breaks, the one who never asks for help. But perfectionism is just addiction wearing a suit. It's the same nervous system, the same shame, the same self-abandonment, hidden behind trophies and degrees. Some people numb with substances, others numb with success. Both are running, both are escaping, both are terrified of stopping, because in the silence, the old wounds wake up. The loneliness no one talks about. Addiction thrives in loneliness, but not physical loneliness, emotional loneliness. The loneliness of being surrounded by people yet unseen. The loneliness of wearing a mask so no one knows the truth. The loneliness of never being able to say, I'm not okay. People with addiction don't fear sobriety. They fear the return of feelings that sobriety brings, feelings they never learned to process, feelings they weren't allowed to have, feelings that feel too heavy to hold. So the addiction becomes their companion, predictable, consistent, available. It never judges, it never leaves, it never asks questions, until it destroys them. When the body breaks before the spirit does. Most people assume addiction breaks a person mentally or morally, but addiction starts by breaking the body. The immune system weakens, the stress hormones skyrocket, the digestive system collapses, the sleep cycle shatters, inflammation rises, energy drops, the body absorbs the punishment long before the person notices. Because someone raised in emotional chaos doesn't notice pain, they normalize it. They grew up learning that discomfort is just life. They learn to endure instead of heal, to tolerate instead of feel, to survive instead of live. The invisible ache, not wanting to be here. Many people won't admit it, but a large number of addicts share one secret thought. I don't want to die, but I don't want to be here either. It's not a suicidal wish, it's an escape wish. An escape from the heaviness in their chest, from the numbness in their soul, from the hollowness that makes ordinary life feel unbearable. Addiction gives them the brief illusion of existing somewhere else, someone else, somehow else. That's why they return, not for pleasure, for disappearance. The cruelest part of addiction is not the substance, nor the behavior, nor the destruction it causes. It's the way it convinces a person that they must go through their suffering alone, that no one would understand the weight they carry, that no one could survive the storm inside them. Addiction isolates before it destroys. It begins with a quiet withdrawal from the world, a soft fading out where the person stops sharing, stops hoping, stops believing in relief. When someone grows up in a home where emotions were dismissed, mocked, ignored, or punished, they internalize one poisonous belief: my pain is mine alone. They learn that vulnerability is dangerous, that needing is risky, that asking for help leads to disappointment. So even as adults, they carry their burdens like a secret illness, a quiet rot beneath the surface of their lives.
Addiction becomes the only place where they can exhale without judgment. It is tragic because what they truly need is connection, but what they seek instead is escape. And the world doesn't make it easier. Society worships strength, productivity, emotional detachment. It celebrates the people who keep it together, who push through, who stay strong. No one questions the cost of that strength. No one asks how much emotional amputation was required to achieve it. A person may be applauded for their resilience while their soul is collapsing quietly behind closed doors. This is why addiction often hides in the lives of those who seem fine, even functioning, even successful. Pain doesn't always look broken. Sometimes it looks disciplined. Sometimes it looks like someone who never slows down because slowing down would expose wounds they've spent their entire lives outrunning. But beneath the surface, addiction grows in the cracks left by emotional abandonment. It grows in the child who never had anyone to confide in. It grows in the teenager who learned to pretend everything was fine. It grows in the adult who smiles while dying inside. And when the addiction finally appears, whether through substances, relationships, work, distractions, or self-destruction, it is not the beginning of the problem, but the echo of everything that came before. The roots of addiction are always older than the addiction itself. One of the most misunderstood realities is that addiction is not about the substance, it's about the state of consciousness the substance provides. People don't chase the alcohol, they chase the numbness. They don't chase the drug, they chase the silence. They don't chase the high, they chase the disappearance of shame, anxiety, loneliness, and self-hatred. They chase a feeling their childhood never gave them: safety. It doesn't matter whether the addiction is chemical or behavioral, gambling, sex, food, digital immersion, self-harm, toxic relationships, because the underlying mechanism is identical. A temporary shift away from the inner chaos they have no other tools to regulate. The nervous system can't tolerate its own intensity, so it reaches for something, anything, that turns the intensity down. The tragedy is that the same solution that soothes them is the one that eventually consumes them. And when addiction grows stronger, another layer emerges: despair. Not the loud, dramatic despair seen in movies, but the quiet, suffocating despair that whispers, "Maybe this is all I'll ever be." Shame wraps itself around them like a second skin. Every relapse becomes a confirmation of their worst fear: I am defective. They don't understand that relapse is not a failure of willpower, it's a symptom of untreated pain. When the root wound remains unaddressed, the nervous system returns automatically to the only strategy it knows. People judge addicts for going back to their coping mechanism, but no one questions why society is filled with coping mechanisms in the first place. Addictions thrive in cultures where pain is silenced, emotions are stigmatized, and vulnerability is seen as a flaw. We raise children who learn to hide their feelings, then punish them as adults when they hide inside addictions. And it goes deeper. The environments that produce addiction often produce denial as well. Families that never learn to speak truthfully about pain continue the cycle across generations. Parents who never healed their own wounds unconsciously pass them on. A child watches their father drown in work instead of dealing with emotion, and they learn to do the same. A child watches their mother numb herself with shopping, comfort eating, social media, or silent withdrawal, and they absorb those patterns. Trauma is rarely taught directly, it is absorbed through atmosphere. Homes with emotional numbness feel like cold winters that never end. Homes with volatility feel like earthquakes waiting for a trigger. Homes with emotional absence feel like deserts. Children raised in these climates grow into adults with weathered souls, always bracing for storms even after the danger is past. Addiction also intersects with identity. People with trauma often cling to personas they created to survive: the caretaker, the joker, the achiever, the strong one, the invisible one.
These identities were necessary in childhood but suffocating in adulthood. They prevent authenticity, connection, and vulnerability, all things required for healing. Addiction becomes a refuge from the pressure of maintaining the mask. The more exhausted the person becomes from pretending, the more they rely on their chosen escape. This leads to one of the darkest truths. Addiction is not about wanting to die, it's about being exhausted from trying to live. The weight of unprocessed childhood pain grows heavier with age. It accumulates, it compounds, it spreads. A person can only run from their inner world for so long before their body begins to collapse under the emotional weight. So addiction steps in, not as a destroyer at first, but as a caretaker, a misguided, harmful, yet understandable caretaker. The substance becomes the friend, the behavior becomes the comfort, the ritual becomes the only reliable part of their emotional life. But the comfort turns into chains, the escape becomes dependence, the relief becomes poison. Eventually, addiction stops numbing the pain and starts amplifying it. The shame grows louder, the isolation grows colder, the loneliness becomes punishing. The body deteriorates, the mind collapses, the relationships crumble, and the person finds themselves in the darkest place of all, a life that hurts too much to stay in, and a shame that hurts too much to escape from. And still, this does not mean they are broken. It means they were forced to survive without the emotional tools they needed. It means their pain was never witnessed. It means their childhood taught them to run instead of rest, to numb instead of express, to hide instead of trust. Addiction is not a sign of moral weakness. It is evidence of how deeply someone was wounded before they had the chance to understand what was happening to them. And the most heartbreaking part, the shame they carry, is never theirs. It belonged to the adults who failed them, to the society that silenced them, to the generations before them who passed on pain instead of healing. They are carrying a burden that was never meant for their shoulders. Healing does not begin when the addiction ends. Healing begins when the truth finally becomes safe enough to feel. When a person who spent their entire life running from themselves finally slows down, not because they want to, but because the running has exhausted every cell in their body. The world glorifies strength, discipline, and self-control, but no one teaches the quiet, terrifying skill of sitting with your own pain without trying to escape it. When someone has lived decades inside emotional chaos, silence can feel like violence. Stillness can feel like danger. Sobriety can feel like exposure. So the healing journey is not a straight line. It is a slow, trembling, disorienting process of learning how to live inside your own skin. The first step is not quitting. The first step is understanding. Understanding where the hurt began. Understanding which parts of you learn to disappear. Understanding why the body trembles at night or why the mind shuts down when someone gets too close. Understanding why certain voices trigger panic or why certain emotions feel life-threatening. Healing doesn't demand perfection, it demands honesty. And honesty is terrifying for someone who grew up having to hide their inner world. To heal, you must walk back into the rooms where you abandoned yourself. You must reopen the stories you swore you'd never revisit. You must feel the grief you buried because no one was there to hold it. That is why healing feels unbearable at first. People think trauma is the memory of what happened, but trauma is the loneliness of what happened. Facing horrors without support, fear without comfort, sadness without arms around you. Healing requires giving yourself what you never received. It requires reparenting the child inside you who waited decades for someone to say, "You didn't deserve any of this." And this is where many people resist healing, not because they don't want it, but because the pain they would have to face is older and heavier than their entire adult life. This is why Gabor Maté says the core of trauma is disconnection from the self. When children are emotionally abandoned, they learn to abandon themselves. When they are punished for expressing emotion, they learn to silence themselves. When they are ignored, they learn to ignore their own needs. By adulthood, they don't have a self to return to. They only have a collection of survival patterns that became personality traits. So healing feels like dismantling your identity. It feels like betrayal. It feels like death. Because the version of you that learned to survive wasn't built to heal, it was built to endure. But endurance has an expiration date. Eventually, the human soul demands truth. The human body demands rest. The human heart demands connection. Healing begins when survival stops being enough. And then comes grief. Grief for the childhood you never had, grief for the safety you never felt, Grief for the love you never received? Grief for the years lost to pain, shame, addiction, self-hatred? Grief for the person you became because you had no other choice. This grief is not weakness, it is liberation. It is the unfreezing of years of emotional silence. It is the return of the parts of you that had to die for you to survive. It is the beginning of reclaiming yourself from the ruins of your own history.
But this process is slow. Pain resurfaces in unpredictable waves. Old habits claw their way back. Shame tells you you're regressing. But the truth is, relapses, emotional flooding, and confusion are not signs of failure. They are signs that your nervous system is learning to feel again. Healing is messy, uncomfortable, terrifying, and holy. And as healing deepens, something remarkable begins to happen. You start to see your addiction for what it always was, not a monster, but a messenger, not a moral flaw, but a survival instinct, not a curse, but a temporary doorway out of unbearable suffering. You start to see the wound beneath the behavior, the hurt beneath the habit, the child beneath the chaos. You start to understand that addiction was never trying to destroy you. It was trying to protect you in the only way it knew how. It was trying to give you a break from pain no one helped you carry. And when that realization lands, shame loosens its grip. Compassion enters, not the soft, sentimental kind, but the fierce, honest kind. The kind that says, you did what you had to do, and now you can choose differently. And here is the hardest truth. Healing requires connection. The opposite of addiction is not sobriety. It is connection. But connection is terrifying for someone who has been wounded by the people they trusted most. Connection requires vulnerability, and vulnerability requires safety. Most addicts have never experienced safety, not enough to trust it. Safety was inconsistent, conditional, or non-existent. So healing is not about trusting others right away. It is about learning to trust yourself first. Trusting that your feelings make sense. Trusting that your needs matter. Trusting that your body is not your enemy. Trusting that you are allowed to take up space. Trusting that you deserve support. Trusting that someone can hold your truth without breaking you. And as that trust slowly forms, something shifts in the body. The nervous system, once trapped in survival mode, begins to learn new rhythms. Breath deepens, muscles loosen, hypervigilance softens, the internal alarms quiet. A sense of safety, real safety, not numbed safety, begins to take root. This safety is fragile but sacred. It grows slowly through consistency, compassion, boundaries, and presence. And as safety grows, the need for escape weakens. The addiction loses its power not because the urge disappears, but because the person finally has other ways to soothe themselves. Healing is not the erasure of pain, it is the integration of pain. It is the shift from my trauma defines me to my trauma shaped me, but I am not its prisoner. It is the shift from running to resting, from numbing to feeling, from hiding to revealing, from self-abandonment to self-return. And perhaps the most important transformation of all, you begin to realize that you were never the addiction. You were the one trying to survive the loneliness beneath it. This is why your story matters. This is why your voice matters. This is why these truths matter. You were never weak. You were never beyond repair. You were hurt, and healing is your return home. If you reach this point, something inside you recognized the truth behind these words. Maybe a pain you never named. Maybe a memory you hid. Maybe just the feeling of not being so alone. This video wasn't made to entertain, it was made to touch. And if it touched you, even if painfully, then it fulfilled its purpose. You gave space to a conversation the world avoids. And if you want to go further, if this message truly resonates, you can support keeping this kind of content alive. If you want to show direct gratitude, you can use the super thanks below, a way of saying, this made a difference to me. But know this, just by watching, liking, sharing, you're doing more than you think. You're spreading a message that can truly change lives. Because maybe what heals is not the answer. Maybe what heals is finally being seen. Here we don't pretend everything is okay. Here we choose truth.